Hello, today is Thursday, January 2nd, 2025. I'm Tony Mangino from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's podcast, I'm joined by Ben Fox, one of TC2's managing directors, and Brian Carricker, one of TC2's senior consultants. And we're going to have a discussion about recent and ongoing trends in outsourcing services and deals. So, Brian, how's the outsourcing and managed services market doing?
That's a great question, Tony, and thanks for inviting me to Staying Connected. You know, as you can expect, there's plenty of sources out there that are willing to calculate the sizing of the global managed services market and forecast how things are going to grow. In general, the summary of this global market is worth about a few $100 billion, and it's expected to have an annual growth rate in the coming years of anywhere from 6 to 13% is what we're seeing. And without wanting to comment on those specific numbers, we're certainly seeing the IT outsourcing area as a growth area for our clients, and it has been for many years. And we're seeing many different growth drivers, whether it's a simple expansion of the scope of existing outsourcing as a company becomes more familiar with managed services and requires new capabilities, the cloud capabilities as an example, right, where managed services is growing into those spaces. And then we're also seeing where it's just a simple function of it's easier and better services that are provided through the outsourcing partner to bring more expertise instead of growing that internal function.
Yeah, that's right, Brian. Definitely. But it's also interesting to reflect on how enterprises have evolved, how they consume and construct outsourcings. So a good example is that so-called factory-style managed services. We see that that's largely dead at this point for large enterprises.
Ben, can you elaborate on factory-style managed services?
Yes, certainly. So a factory-style managed service is where the service provider uses staff and resources that are shared over multiple customers, rather than having a dedicated set of personnel for each individual client. So effectively, whatever function you've outsourced, when a ticket is opened or work or support is required, any one of the resources in the so-called factory could be assigned to your work requirement. It's a first off the bench type of system, if you will. And so for small customers or for small requirements, that can be very cost effective, where a dedicated team would be sitting around with nothing to do for much of the time. But there are various and really quite meaningful shortcomings. So the first off the bench system means that inevitably the resource that you are assigned to work on your task or issue, that's rarely someone that already knows your company and infrastructure, which makes it harder to work expeditiously and efficiently on support issues. So in a nutshell, a service provider never really builds up any tribal knowledge about the customer. And also, only very limited customization is possible because a factory needs to use the same standard processes across all of its supported customers. It can't adopt bespoke processes for individual clients. And also, you almost always have to adopt and use the service provider's tools, whether you want to or not, because a factory can't use different tools for different customers. That just wouldn't be a factory anymore if it did.
Right. So these days, almost all of our outsourcing deals that we're working on are based on the dedicated supplier staffing model and not this factory model. This means that the service provider has a dedicated and permanent staff to deliver the required outsourcing services. And because these resources only support one customer, the services they provide can be entirely customized to our clients, such as following the customer's IT processes and procedures, specific training requirements, working with customers' tools, and so on. In these models, it's not unusual to see the service provider implement a customer academy that provides specific training for the customer's business, their culture as part of the onboarding process for the service provider's resources to help fully align the resources with the customer's needs and expectations for the outsourced services. So I agree with Ben. For our clients, the factory model style of managed services is pretty much disappeared at this point.
It's interesting that you both mentioned tooling when talking about the factory versus dedicated staffing models. It seems like tooling approaches have also evolved.
That's for sure. They have evolved. There's certainly a time when one of the key benefits for outsourcing with a service provider was that they brought leading edge tools as an inherent part of their service. This meant that the service provider owned the tools. They're responsible for picking the best tools, deploying it, keeping it up, keeping it updated, and all of those things that go along with ownership there. It's also perhaps the service provider had more scale and more buying power for these tools, and hence it was cheaper. But then, of course, we all know of several different providers that develop their own in-house tools. This had a lot of potential values, but there were some definite, very significant advantages. For instance, deploying on a wide scale IT tool is complicated and time consuming. So the client felt that they were locked into an existing service provider. So moving from service provider to service provider based on pricing of the service wasn't a possibility because you didn't want to change the tooling out. And sometimes you'd have the customer tools and the supplier's tools, and oftentimes the only option was a dreaded EBON to get your information from one system to the other.
Yeah, that's very true, Brian. So I think what has happened is that customers have realized that it's better to select and deploy and own their own tooling. And via that dedicated staffing model that we were just talking about, have the outsource provider use and work natively in the customer's tooling. And I think a big catalyst for this particular trend is all the money and the effort that customers have spent in recent years on large ITSM tools, and not least, of course, ServiceNow. Once customers made that investment, they wanted their service providers to use their ServiceNow tool it implemented rather than, for instance, the service provider's ticketing tool. And once they'd made the service provider move to their ServiceNow tool, it kind of became a natural move to also invest in other IT tooling. It could be monitoring tools, automation tools, or whatever, and then have your service provider use and work in and often maintain and manage those tools that the customer owns. So interestingly, as Brian was alluding to, that makes it much easier to switch outsourced suppliers because you don't have to also switch out the tooling as part of switching out the supplier. And it also gives you much better visibility and control of the environment. So for instance, you no longer have to have that age-old fight of whether or not you have right access to the tools or the infrastructure when you need or want it. I also think that even though outsourcing strategies remain, somewhat about outsourcing non-strategic work, customers have come to see that actually activities such as deploying AI into operations and deploying automation and everything that goes with all of that, that's actually all pretty strategic. And thus it's better to retain ownership and control of that by owning the tools, even where you are outsourcing certain functions that are delivered in part, by using such tools.
Got it. Thanks, Ben. The other topic I've heard you and Brian talk about recently are experience level agreements, or XLAs, as an alternative to SLAs or service level agreements. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, Tony. These XLAs, we have been talking about that, and it seems to be a hot topic right now. For instance, Gartner's viewpoint seems to be that XLAs are replacing traditional SLAs. And for instance, in their 2023 Digital Workspace Services Magic Quadrant, Gartner stated that it had observed a significant growth in the demand for experience-based metrics and outcomes in the ODWS space. And with that the leading vendors offer SLAs to truly focus on employee experience and are willing to commit part of their revenues to better outcomes there.
Okay, so I'll ask the question, what exactly is an XLA?
I would say XLA is a bit nebulous, really, Tony. The core concept here is a philosophy that is aimed towards measuring the end user's holistic experience and satisfaction with an IT service they're using, rather than measuring a mundane concept like how quickly was an issue resolved or how quickly is a service request being completed. This concept is reflecting upon the fact that just because an IT service is resolved in a particular contractual SLA, that doesn't necessarily mean that the end user is satisfied. Just because the issue is fixed in X number of hours doesn't always avoid the fact that an end user had a bad experience and it ended up messing up or delaying their deliverables in the first place.
Yeah, I agree with that, Brian. I would say that our real world experience is that traditional outsourcing kind of fees at risk SLA construct that indeed we've talked about in the past on Staying Connected, those fees at risk constructs, they're still prevalent with largely, I would say, traditional service metrics, despite what Gartner may say. And of course, service providers are very willing to define entirely custom service level metrics in that fees at risk construct, to a large extent, whatever the client is looking to measure. And I think the reality is that you still need key SLA metrics rather than XLA metrics, key SLA metrics for vendors to solution against. For example, you can't size an outsourced contact center really without an average speed of answer SLA. So you really can't completely shift to just XLA concepts. But I would say that more in line with Gartner's view, we definitely do see service providers looking to differentiate themselves by supplementing those more traditional SLAs with XLAs. And how it works is that the proposed XLAs and the associated kind of experience measures, they tend to be based on vendor proprietary tooling, which is typically simply combining many different metrics into an aggregate overall experience measure. So for instance, metrics such as user sentiment, device health, application health, and all sorts of other attributes that can be combined. And then that combined metric has to be baselined. And then the service provider commits to performance levels and improvement targets that are set against that baseline level of performance at the start of a contract. So it's not that there is a predefined XLA performance level that the supplier agrees to meet. And of course, because of that, it makes it very difficult to define explicit XLAs in an RFP that then multiple vendors can bid against and be assessed against, unlike traditional SLAs, which of course can readily be included in RFPs and included in those competitive negotiations.
Thanks so much, Ben and Brian. It sounds like XLAs are still evolving, and it'll be interesting to see how they develop in the coming years. To our listeners, if you'd like to learn more about IT outsourcing deals, XLAs, or if you'd like to discuss other ICT needs with Ben, Brian, or me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues, please give us a call or shoot us an email. You can also stay current by subscribing to Staying Connected, checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.